Okay, welcome everyone again to our first webinar that is reflecting cost pushes and local currency issues in pricing. I propose we start, and once some other people would like to join, we will let them in. Please also keep in mind that all people joining the webinar are muted by default, but please feel free to use the chat of this call to say hi to other participants or ask any questions or place any comments. So let's go. And first of all, let me tell a little bit about myself and to give you a little bit of background facts about me so that you stop asking possible questions. Who is this guy to be telling us how to behave in crisis times in terms of pricing? So I have considerable experience in market and business analytics. Started back in 2006 in the market research agency. So when the crisis of 2008 hit, I was doing large consumer surveys that allowed us to model the demand, the changing demand in conditions of plummeting economics and how shoppers make their choices in terms of redistributing their spend, choosing to increase consumption of certain categories over other categories, choosing certain brands over other brands, etc. And then many of you are aware that in 2014 we had our local crisis that was at the same time quite severe in Ukraine. Back in 2014, I was an insights manager in Mars Inc. And then I did my first pricing strategy. It was based on modeling of the demand in volatile conditions. Actually, the recommendations that I've made and the strategic framework of repricing that I've produced was accepted and implemented by the company, and it allowed it to grow both in terms of volume share and in terms of profitability. I spent a year and a half in Dublin, Ireland, where I was a member of the European Pricing Council, developing pricing tools, pricing analysis tools, and implementing those with multiple markets and across different categories. And in January 2018, I changed my career track a little bit and joined Competera company as their first data scientist. And currently I'm a pricing science lead at Competera, defining the strategic course of algorithms development to address the pricing needs of retailers around the world. But before I start sharing with you some tips on how to do pricing in crisis times, let us review typical business growth drivers and how their impact is different in crisis times versus peaceful times, as I can call them. So if we consider three main drivers of revenue growth, which are awareness about your brand or label, availability of certain products in retail, and the number of retail outlets or points of other points of contact with your shopper, and the relevance, which is a little bit more of art rather than science, but nonetheless very important. Typically, the three of them are equally important to actually make this flywheel turn and grow your sales. However, in the times of very volatile demand, the awareness becomes less of an issue, and actually many manufacturers and retailers stop investment in advertising at all. Whereas the product availability And the supply of needed amount of merchandise becomes crucial in order to maintain the transactions, especially in the categories with so-called panic buying. And also in terms of relevance, we can see that essential categories actually boom, while non-essential categories plummet in sales. Also, compared to the regular impact of pricing in stable times, relative price attractiveness becomes playing a more important role than ever, as well as magic price points that are also known as price thresholds become prominent in managing the prices to grow your sales. But we're going to touch upon this a bit later. And now let's review the key pricing needs in general, and also how they are important changes in crisis times. So overall, at Competera, we have identified 5 most important need states or needs in terms of pricing in retail, and those are well, first of all, finding balance between scale and profitability. I would say this is an omnipresent need, and every retailer tries to reach this by doing analysis of their past pricing actions and trying to predict how their price changes would contribute both to growing turnover and the profitability maintenance, which is not an easy task at all, and I'm going to talk about this as well. Also, there are typical need states of grabbing market share via best price guarantee strategy execution or heavy discounting or markdowns. It's also a bit of an issue how to set the first price for new entries and new products, because we can only assume how their rate of sales will look like after we launch them. But at the same time, we need to set the price for them a couple of months before they even hit shelves. And also, if we talk about crisis time specifically, 2 need states become quite acute. One is getting rid of old stock because, as I mentioned, in non-essential categories, there is plummeting demand, and it becomes very difficult to clear warehouses of the supplies that otherwise would have been sold in weeks, but have to stay in storehouses for months instead. And then the focus of my webinar today is actually how to reflect cost pushes that actually I think are faced by retailers around the world and across all industries. It's not only the issue of local currencies devaluating versus more stable currencies, like, for example, ruble or Argentinian peso devaluating against US dollar or euro, but also it's it is an effect of supply chains becoming more inefficient and thus more expensive. So this is another source of a cost push. Also, as an example, it became much more difficult for cocoa beans and coffee beans pickers to actually pick the crop in Latin America due to the lockdowns, and it has resulted in coffee and cocoa raw materials significant price growth. So these are all cost pushes that we need to reflect in our shelf prices somehow. And when we get down to this task, many of us, I would assume, become quite nervous because we don't understand how to properly do this. And typically many retailers default to some sort of blanket repricing when they just mirror the cost push percentage in the price increase percentage across the category. And as a result, they see damaged demand in some SKUs being so significant that it actually brings the whole, the total category performance in sales numbers to negative because of the high elasticities of some products that you have underestimated. Okay, these are the issues, and now let's get down to some solutions as we see them. Well, one tip is linked to that my previous point about the increased importance of relative price attractiveness rather than the importance of absolute price points. And the idea here is trying to be the last to increase prices where the whole industry has to review prices upwards. And here's an example of pricing behavior or pricing strategies of four candy manufacturers or candy vendors in Ukraine, trying to save their marginality, but at the same time not to damage their share of market. So I will not name these players, but they are all multinational candy manufacturers. And please pay attention to the pale blue and the pale brown ones. They actually kept the prices unchanged for the first 5 months of 2014, which, as I may remind you, was a crisis year in Ukraine and significant local currency devaluation was taking place. In sharp contrast to those, a player that is represented here with a red line has started reflecting cost pushes immediately, and they started increasing their price per kilogram significantly. And then quite shortly, the white vendor has followed and has also started increasing prices. After 6 or 7 months, however, the pale brown and the pale blue manufacturers had to follow because they could not afford they could not afford actually amortization of these cost pushes in their P&L anymore, so they had to review prices upwards. So they started doing this, but please have a look at their market share. They have waited long enough before they followed the price increases of bolder manufacturers. And those who actually initiated the price increases early in the year, they suffered in volume share significantly. Please have a look at the volume share of the red player. They have actually lost around 1 percentage point of volume share in total year terms. Whereas the white player turned out to be less elastic. And I can tell you that they are manufacturers of more premium candies. So it's no wonder they have suffered less. But at the same time, their volume share has declined by the end of the year. However, if we have a look at the market share of the pale blue and pale brown manufacturers, they have started gaining market share and they have benefited a lot. So if you have a look at pale blue vendor, they have managed to increase prices by 50% by the end of 2014. But at the same time, they have gained 0.9% volume share for total year 2014 as compared to their full year market share in 2013. I have seen quite a few such examples of manufacturers or retailers who have used this lagged price increase strategy, gaining market share or even gaining leadership in the market. So this is definitely a strategy I would recommend. It's just that you need to think how to absorb the cost pushes for a couple of months in your P&L. Because you can expect gains in the future. You just need to be tolerant. And then if you consider following this strategy, the next question you might probably ask yourself is, well, who are my competitors? Whom should I follow? And this is a very tricky question. In case of industries where you have only 4 or 5 players and you have some retail audit data like Nielsen market share data or some other supplier of similar data. It's easy to identify who the market leader is and whom to follow actually. But imagine some e-commerce, or rather imagine a marketplace where you have dozens or sometimes hundreds of competitors. It becomes out of control, and what retailers choose to do is actually they buy some competitive data, like Competera's competitive data, and they set up some automated rule of following a minimum market price found by a crawler in combination with some minimum marginality they can afford on a certain SKU. It actually results in overreacting to what happens in the market in terms of pricing, and in the long run, it leads to significant margin dilution on the KVIs that are typically selected to fight against the competitive KVIs in marketplaces. So instead of doing this, we recommend applying some science here and try to calculate the intensity of negative impact of certain competitors on your sales. It's also not an easy task, but to my point of view, it's much better than overreacting to the minimal prices found in the market or in some industry, in e-commerce. So in Competera, we apply some advanced machine learning algorithms that help us evaluate the cause and effect of competitive pricing action and the reaction of our sales, of the sales of our customers, in order to demonstrate our customers the intensity of the negative impact by top competitors, so that instead of reacting to all 20 or all 30 competitive pricing action, they start reacting only to the price reductions done by a couple or 3 competitors, which significantly decreases the overreaction. And based on our experience, it can improve your margin significantly without you losing on the rate of sales. And then, okay, let's imagine we have decided to use this price followership strategy with some time lag, and we have identified our competitors, or have asked Competera to help us identify these competitors, adjust our automated repricing rules accordingly. Then another issue is actually the suppliers coming with updated price lists where some unpleasant surprises like list price increases for some KVIs take place. And actually suppliers have more analytical capacities in-house to be prepared better for such pricing negotiations compared to a typical retailer. And which makes things worse is actually what all they care about is their market share, and they rarely care about the impact of their price recommendations or promo recommendations on the total category where they play. Also, different suppliers have different approach to reflecting cost pushes in their list prices. Some of them go more aggressive, like the red player in one of the charts I've demonstrated earlier, and some of them go less aggressive. So overall, you can see that there are broken pack price curves if you just apply these price changes and do not change your profit margin by SKU. And finally, to crown it all, your government might start controlling prices for so-called socially important goods. For example, at least in 3 countries where we have operations, we've seen actions taken by governments in order to start controlling prices on some very important items like toilet paper some porridge, milk, etc. So these are the items that shoppers started panic buying, sorry, when the COVID crisis hit. And this is where you might see, sometimes you might face zero marginality because you have to follow government regulations. So these three things result in the fact that less marginal products start growing much faster than more marginal products. And this can damage the profitability of the entire categories. So how do you deal with this? The only way you can deal with these three factors is actually reviewing your margin, the retail margin, on the items where there are no government regulations, in order to arrive to more balanced and more coherent shelf prices across the category as they are faced by shoppers. I call it differentiated repricing. It means doing the repricing, taking into account individual price elasticities of demand for each product for which you have to make a price revision, as well as cross-product impacts, for example, sales cannibalization. And this is also a very difficult task because you have to have analytical capacities to actually calculate these price elasticity coefficients. And many pricing analysts and many category managers in retailers don't even know how to calculate the price elasticity coefficients properly. So luckily, there are a lot of solutions that can help you here, like Competera's demand-based pricing module. And these solutions, again, luckily for retailers, they are being designed to match the scale of the product ranges that retailers handle, so that to handle the computational heavy part of finding the combination of price points to cloud capabilities of Google or Amazon, for example. And one more thing I was going to mention in this regard is the existence of so-called price thresholds. These are typically round price points that when you try to cross them, your price elasticity becomes out of control. And there are price thresholds in terms of minimum price of product, but also in terms of a maximum price of a product as well. So for certain products, if you decrease your price or you run a discount by just less than 10% for a product that costs $100 or €100 or 100 other units, then in a white line represented on the chart, you still are actually above a lower price threshold in your final selling price, and you are facing a regular elasticity that actually doesn't compensate for a price reduction that you have made, so you start losing revenue if you run such discounts. But if you run a discount deep enough and you are able to cross the $85 price threshold, you can benefit from a significantly increasing price elasticity, so that your total revenue, or in certain cases even your gross profit, can start growing as a result of such promo activity. And this is what we call successful promo activity, which according to many global research don't exceed 40% of all promos run by retailers, unfortunately. Also, there are price thresholds in cases when you need to increase prices, and these are much more dangerous because actually you can damage your, well, you have to increase prices. And if you apply a blanket price increase for a total category, as I mentioned, on certain items, the decline in demand will be so disproportionate that you know, when you just increase the price on a certain item by 10%, their demand will drop by 30%. And this is, and if this is a top seller, which is quite often the case, it will damage your total category revenue. I'm not even talking about your total category gross profit. So these are things you have to keep in mind. But you also need to keep in mind that these price thresholds are not carved in stone, and they are not set forever in shoppers' minds. They migrate in the direction of growing, hopefully, and luckily for us. But this migration is very slow because shoppers tend to have strong thinking inertia and price perception inertia. And for example, if a total industry had to review their prices upwards and an average shelf price in an industry has grown by 10%, but in a month, shoppers will still remember the old prices and they will mentally reject the new prices. And if you ask them what a fair prices, what a fair average prices for a product from this category is, they will mention you the old price, not the new price that is already omnipresent. And this actually hinders the demand of the items that have crossed these round price points as a result of price changes. So you really have to keep this in mind and be careful while doing a price increase. You have to trace down the SKUs that will cross round price points as a result of your planned price increase, and try to again make a differentiated price increase so that you make a smaller price change on an items that are about to cross price threshold, but then a greater price increase on the items that are far below price thresholds or potential price thresholds. It will let you not face the situations that I've described earlier, where the demand on some top sellers will plummet. But again, as I mentioned, this demand curve and the thresholds will migrate, but you have to wait for a certain time. And typically, shoppers adopt new price levels within 3 or 6 months after a massive repricing done by an industry. So it's another argument for you to wait a little bit and try to be one of the last ones to increase prices in an industry if you really have to. So how do you know whether the price thresholds have moved in a direction beneficial for you, and now you have some more room to increase prices than before? Okay, I'm just gonna cover this slide and then I will respond to a question from the chat because my next slide was actually a summary. Okay, so this is a chart from so-called price sensitivity meter research. This is a consumer survey, and this is a kind of survey that I really liked in the past when I've done a lot of them. And I saw them working as expected in many cases when the manufacturers that I used to work for had to review their prices upwards. So now I will explain you how to read these charts and how to actually get these numbers. So the idea is simple. You need to pick a couple of dozens of SKUs that, well, first of all, they are top sellers. And secondly, they are about to cross a round price point. So they are under threat of crossing this price threshold and having damaged demand curve as a result. So typically, even for a large retailer, the number of such items should not exceed 50. So for each of these items, you have to interview at least 150 respondents who are typical shoppers in this category. And you ask them 4 simple questions. The first is, what is the price for this item that you would consider so low that you would not buy this item? The second is what price point you would consider low, but at the same time not suspicious at all, and you will buy this item. And then the rest of two questions are the same questions, but for prices being high and too high. So the curve that I really like coming out of such researches is the red curve. This is a cumulative percentage of the responses on an x-axis of prices sorted by the price from the smallest to the greatest. And here you can see the actually percentage of potential lapsed shoppers in your label or in your category or in your brand at each price point, both from current times and from the future. So imagine that certain item that is a top seller costs 22 or 23 euro currently, and you are considering making its price above 25 euro. So you need to reflect the cost push. So you are making a price revision of 9%, which takes this item above 25 as an example. You can see from this study that bringing the price of this item above 25 will result in churn of around 10% of your current shopper base. But think about increasing the price for this item above 30 euro. In this case, cumulatively, you are exposed to churn of up to 50% of your shopper base. And these thresholds are very, very indicative. And in all cases that I've done this research and implemented these insights in price revisions later, I've seen exactly the reaction of demand predicted by this study. So I would highly recommend running such a study in cases when you have to review prices upwards. And of course, please feel free to reach out to Competera, and our pricing architect can advise you on how to properly set up this shopper research. Okay, now let me stop for a while and see if we have any questions. And I assume we have a question. Second. Oh, I'll get back to it. Okay, so what is the best way to determine the price threshold for online when the range of competitors is huge? Yeah, so hopefully I've answered this question already. Or actually, you don't have to do it for many items and for many competitors, because when shoppers will be responding to your questions about too high prices, they will keep in mind all the competition and overall prices in the category. And regardless of what competitors do with the pricing, and if shoppers say hard no to price exceeding certain threshold, all competitors in your industry will suffer if they try to cross. And of course, if all the competitors, all the retailers in this segment will review the price and will cross the price threshold, it will break. But so the suffering of demand will be short term. But anyway, shoppers will try to reduce consumption of this category and will try to find category substitutes instead of buying a category, because they will be really, really unhappy with the price change that the industry has made. So we're approaching actually the end of my main story, and let me summarize the tips that I've made earlier, so that we have some more time for questions, for Q&A afterwards. So the first tip that I've given you in the beginning is actually, if you really have to review prices upwards, try to be one of the last to do so, and at least please wait until the category leader or the industry leader have done price increases. Then in terms of targeting certain competitors to follow with your pricing strategy and pricing tactics, you need to know who your true competitors are, especially in e-com, where there's no such notion as a category leader, and especially in marketplaces where there are hundreds of sellers competing with you. Luckily, Competera is here to help you with identifying the competitive pressure on your sales, and thus limiting your reaction with automated price rules only to price reductions by really significant competitors. So when you're done with defining your price followership strategy and identifying your competition, you need to somehow make differentiated price increases that instead of mirroring reviewed list prices by vendors, would be based on the price elasticity of demand of individual SKUs, as well as cross elasticities within the baskets. And finally, if you have a chance, try not to cross round price points that are also known as price thresholds, if you really don't really have to. But in case you have to, run a short but really powerful and impactful shopper study that will highlight you some price thresholds from the future that you will then try to not cross for at least 3 months, or wait for all players in the industry to cross them and then be the last to do so, and benefit from gaining volume share and revenue share. But at the same time, you will have a chance to review your prices upwards a bit later to fix your marginality. So hopefully we have enough time for you to be able to ask your questions in chat. But in case you have any questions later, please feel free to reach out to Competera, and we will assign a pricing expert who will be more than happy to answer your question. So in order to get in contact with Competera regarding the True Competitors module, or demand-based module that helps you do smart differentiated price revisions, you can scan this QR code that you can see on the screen, and you will be put in touch with Competera shortly. I will give you some time for those of you who are interested to scan the QR code. So that's it from me for today, and we have a couple of more minutes for questions. So hopefully, Anna, I have answered your question about determining the price thresholds for online. Any other questions at this point? Okay, we have one more question. Another channel. Oh, sorry. Yeah. What if the government really starts controlling the price of some products, leaving them without repricing? Yeah, this is something you have to do, not to violate the regulations. But luckily and typically, there are just a couple of products in each category that are regulated by the government. So you will start losing margin on these products, but also you will somehow need to compensate these losses by repricing other products in the category that won't be regulated by the government. And the only way to do so in a smart way is actually to know which products are substitutes and which products are complementary to those controlled by the government. So they are in the same basket or in competing baskets of shoppers coming to your stores or considering between you and other stores. So you need to be able to establish these cross-product impacts to make smart price changes on uncontrolled products where the prices are not controlled by the government, so that overall at a category level, you compensate these margin losses coming from regulated products. And I can give you an example here. So in Ukraine, the government recently had an idea of controlling a price on a milk, but only on a certain milk. It's only a milk that has 2.5% fat in it. And it will not control prices on other milks available from retailers. So retailers just need to admit that, okay, the marginality could become zero on this 2.5% fat milk. But then they can review prices on other milks and they can build a very healthy pack price curve or pack price architecture across their milk range, so that they price more on products with more added value in the eyes of shoppers, and still you will be entitled to such price premiums because of lower price elasticity. So the only way to do so is actually to sit down and calculate the price elasticity and cross price elasticity coefficients in this category, or let Competera do this for you. So assuming that we will get questions at a later point in time, let me finish this webinar and let me thank you a lot for taking part in it and listening to our story, and hopefully you found the tips useful, and hope to have a proper conversation around it with you in the future. Okay, bye now.